They say there's a current that runs under every life, a deep river of what could be, what should be. Most folks, they walk their path on dry land, maybe catching a glimpse of that river through a crack in the soil, wondering about its pull. They hear the rumble, feel the tremor, but they've been taught to fear the flood, to fear diving into the unknown depths. So they stay put, safe and dry, convincing themselves the river's just a trick of the light, a dream for somebody else. They live a good, honest life, but every now and then when the world gets quiet, a little ache settles in their chest, the weight of the untapped, the strength never called upon, the fear never faced. They think that strength, that courage, it's only for the heroes in the movies, for the ones born with a special kind of fire. But sometimes, just sometimes, that river, it finds a way to break through, and when it does, it shows a man what he's truly made of. Lester was one of those men who walked the dry land, or so he thought. 47 years old, a factory man through and through. You could tell just by looking at him. His name was Lester, and the exhaust fumes of the steel mill where he'd spent the last 25 years clung to him like an invisible second skin, a faint metallic scent that never quite washed off, even after a scalding shower. He wasn't a big man, not in the way they cast heroes on the silver screen, but he was sturdy, built like a low-slung, reliable engine that just kept humming day in, day out. His work uniform, even freshly laundered, always seemed to sag a little, hinting at the endless grind it had already endured. His face was a map of quiet endurance, etched with lines that didn't come from laughter or sun, but from a steady, persistent furrowing of the brow, a constant calculation of angles and gears and the subtle vibrations of aging machinery. His eyes, though, that's where you saw the real story of Lester. They were a muted blue, usually fixed on some point just beyond the immediate, carrying a look that suggested perpetual tiredness, yes, but also a deep-set, almost weary capability. He looked like a man who woke up every morning already half-finished with the day's struggles, yet he always got the job done. There was an underlying sense of quiet resignation in those eyes, a hint of deeper struggles buried just beneath the surface, like an old wrench lost in the overgrown grass behind the workshop. He didn't complain, not out loud anyway. His gruffness wasn't mean-spirited. It was more like a worn-out welcome mat, suggesting he didn't have a lot of extra energy for small talk or pleasantries. He kept to himself, moving through the clatter and roar of the factory floor with a purpose that required little conversation, just efficient, practiced motions. But if a new guy was fumbling with a tricky bolt or a machine jammed up, Lester would be there, a shadow at their shoulder, extending a greasy hand with the right tool, a silent nod of instruction, or a single, dry observation that cut straight to the heart of the problem. His hands told their own story, thick and gnarled, the knuckles swollen slightly, crisscrossed with a roadmap of old scars, a testament to a lifetime of wrestling with unforgiving metal, of pulling, pushing, and fixing. They were capable hands, strong, yet you could also see the tremor of years of repetitive strain, the subtle stiffness that came with holding on too tight for too long. They looked like they could build a house, or strip an engine bare, or carve something delicate if given half a chance. And in that slight contradiction, you might have caught a flicker of the man Lester truly was, buried deep beneath the dust and the grime and the unending hum of the factory floor. They say a man's life ain't measured by the mountains he climbs, but by the mountains he doesn't climb, the ones he walks around or just stares at from a distance, too afraid to even put a foot on the path. And for too many, that mountain ain't made of rock and ice. It's made of what if, of unspoken dreams and the quiet dread of trying and failing. It sits right there, a shadow in the corner of his eye, telling him to stay safe, stay small, to just keep to the flat, familiar ground. But sometimes, if you listen real close, you can hear the faint echo of a man's spirit, kicking at the pebbles, rattling the chains, tired of that shadow, tired of the flat ground. Lester, at 47 years old, knew that shadow well. He carried it with him, tucked neatly beneath his perpetually tired gaze, a gaze that still held a capable glint, even with that underlying sense of quiet resignation in those eyes, a hint of deeper struggles buried just beneath the surface, like an old wrench lost in the overgrown grass behind the workshop. He didn't complain, not out loud anyway. His gruffness wasn't mean-spirited. It was more like a worn-out welcome mat, suggesting he didn't have a lot of extra energy for small talk or pleasantries. He kept to himself, moving through the clatter and roar of the factory floor with a purpose that required little conversation, just efficient, practiced motions. But if a new guy was fumbling with a tricky bolt or a machine jammed up, Lester would be there, A shadow at their shoulder, extending a greasy hand with the right tool, a silent nod of instruction, or a single dry observation that cut straight to the heart of the problem. His hands told their own story, thick and gnarled, the knuckles swollen slightly, crisscrossed with a roadmap of old scars, a testament to a lifetime of wrestling with unforgiving metal, of pulling, pushing, and fixing. They were capable hands, strong, yet you could also see the tremor of years of repetitive strain, the subtle stiffness that came with holding on too tight for too long. They looked like they could build a house, or strip an engine bare, or carve something delicate if given half a chance. And in that slight contradiction, you might have caught a flicker of the man Lester truly was, buried deep beneath the dust and the grime and the unending hum of the factory floor. His own small, single-story house in the blue-collar neighborhood was a testament to that contradiction. The paint might have been a bit faded, the shingles a generation old, but the lawn was always mowed, the hedges trimmed sharp, the porch swept clean. There was pride in that maintenance, a quiet defiance against the slow creep of decay, a stubborn refusal to let things fall apart on his watch. Inside, it was modest, functional, but not without warmth. A framed photo on the mantel showed a smiling young woman with his eyes, a graduation cap perched on her head, Sarah, his daughter. 19 now, she was navigating her way through community college, tuition and books a constant weight on Lester's carefully balanced budget. He supported her with every dime he could spare, and with every quiet encouragement he could offer, though he saw her less often than he'd like, swallowed up by her own studies and part-time job. He was a divorced man, had been for years, and the quiet of his small house often felt too loud, filled only with the hum of the old refrigerator and the echo of what-ifs. He was a man tethered, you see, tethered to the predictable clang of the factory, tethered to the bills that arrived like clockwork, tethered to the hope he had for Sarah, even if his own hopes sometimes felt like dust motes dancing in a forgotten sunbeam. He was dependable, all right. Dependable in a way that sometimes felt like being stuck, like a train on a track that only went one way, forward, but always the same scenery passing by. That steady, unspoken commitment to grit, to enduring hardship without complaint, that was his bedrock, but it was also a heavy stone he carried, sometimes wishing for a moment he could just set it down, just for a while. That quiet ambition, that longing for something more meaningful than his daily grind, it was there, a restless twitch under the skin, a ghost of a dream that stirred sometimes in the dead of night, only to be shooed away by the practical realities of morning. The hum of the old refrigerator was the first sound Lester heard, every single morning, a steady, low drone that cut through the pre-dawn silence of his small house. Then came the chirp, sharp and insistent, of the alarm clock on his nightstand, precisely at 5. No snooze button for Lester. There was no time for it, no room in the tightly packed hours of his day for even 5 extra minutes of slumber. His feet hit the cold linoleum floor with a practiced thud, the movement automatic, born of thousands of repetitions. He'd head to the kitchen, the chill in the air a familiar bite against his skin, and start the coffee machine. The rich, dark scent of the brewing coffee was the only luxury he truly allowed himself at that hour, a moment of sensory pleasure before the day began its relentless push. He'd eat his breakfast, usually toast and black coffee, sometimes an apple, in silence, listening to the quiet settling of the house around him, a house he'd bought cheap after the divorce, and slowly, meticulously poured his spare moments into. A fresh coat of paint here, a tightened screw there. Pride of ownership, they called it, but sometimes it felt more like a fortress he was constantly shoring up against the slow, steady decay of time and circumstance. Then it was into the work clothes, the worn jeans, the faded work shirt, the steel-toed boots. The drive to the factory was short, a familiar blur of streetlights and silent houses, the air still thick with night's last breath. Inside the factory, the air was never silent. It was a symphony of metal on metal, the high-pitched whine of cutting tools, the rhythmic thud of presses, the low growl of forklifts. For Lester, it was the sound of his life. He operated a stamping machine, his hands moving with the precision of a craftsman, feeding sheets of raw steel into the hungry maw of the press, watching as it spat out perfectly formed parts for engine blocks. Day in, day out, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost meditative, but his mind rarely settled. While his hands worked, his thoughts would drift, always circling back to the numbers. The rent, the electricity bill, the car payment, the insurance, and Sarah's tuition. Every stamp, every clang, every finished piece was another drop in the bucket, another dollar earned, another bill held at bay. It was a treadmill, steady and unyielding, and Lester, with his quiet strength, kept running. But beneath the surface of that dependable, stoic man, something else churned. A different kind of noise, not the clang of steel, but the whisper of regret. There was a fear that gnawed at him, not a failure in the common sense. He always paid his bills, he always showed up, but a deeper, more insidious fear of mediocrity. Of looking back one day when the factory noise was a distant echo, and realizing this was all there ever was. Just enough. Just getting by. The ghost of a dream that stirred sometimes in the dead of night. It had a name. Woodworking. He had a small shed out back, meticulous as his house, filled with tools he'd collected over the years, chisels, planes, a well-oiled lathe. The smell of sawdust, pine and oak and cherry was his private perfume, a scent that promised possibilities. He could lose himself in there for hours, shaping a piece of raw timber into something beautiful, a carved box, a delicate rocking horse, a sturdy table. He had a talent, a true gift for it, the kind of quiet mastery that comes from patience and an eye for detail. But that shed, that sanctuary, was also his cage, because for all his skill, all his passion, he never did anything with it. Not truly. He'd make gifts for Sarah, for a neighbor, but he never dared to sell a piece, never displayed one for a stranger's judgment. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach. What if they weren't good enough? What if someone laughed? What if he put his heart and soul into something, offered it up, and it was found wanting? The risk of failure, of having his quiet passion exposed and deemed inadequate, felt far more terrifying than the comfortable, predictable grind of the factory floor. So he avoided it. He'd work on a piece, feel the surge of creation, then tuck it away, another unfulfilled potential in the corner of his mind. The factory job, for all its soul-numbing repetition, was safe. It was known. It didn't ask for his soul, only his time and his hands, and in return it gave him the means to keep his daughter afloat, to maintain his small, quiet life. Confronting the idea of truly pursuing his passion, of stepping out of the shadows with his art, felt like staring into an abyss. It was an uncomfortable truth, a disruption to the established, albeit unsatisfying, routine he'd built brick by brick around himself. So he postponed it. Tomorrow, he'd think. Or next year. Or when Sarah was completely finished with school. Always an excuse, always a reason to keep the dream buried, a quiet ache that persisted beneath the surface of his meticulously maintained calm. A constant reminder of the gap between the man he was and the man he secretly longed to be. The excuse, whatever shape it took, always served its purpose, a flimsy wall he built between himself and the discomfort of ambition. But walls, no matter how carefully constructed, sometimes crack. It happened on a Tuesday, mid-morning. Lester was on the line, hands automatically guiding a freshly molded piece of plastic into the cooling jig, when a sudden, sharp pain lanced through his chest. Not a dull ache, not fatigue, but a searing, insistent jab that stole his breath and sent a cold sweat prickling across his scalp. His vision swam for a second, the fluorescent lights of the factory blurring into a sickly yellow haze. He gripped the workbench, knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Just indigestion, he tried to tell himself, too much coffee, maybe. But the feeling didn't pass. A wave of dizziness washed over him, making the concrete floor feel like a rolling deck. He felt a desperate urge to sit, to lie down, to just stop. He fumbled for the emergency stop button on his station, his fingers clumsy, his mind screaming. He managed to hit it, the line shuddering to a halt around him, drawing the immediate, annoyed gaze of the foreman. "Lester, what in blazes?" The foreman started, but Lester was already leaning heavily against the jig, his face ashen. That afternoon, after a hurried trip to urgent care and a battery of tests, the doctor, a young man with two bright eyes, sat across from him. "Mr. Thompson, everything looks stable for now. Your EKG is clear, blood work is mostly within range. But your blood pressure is high, quite high, and those chest pains combined with the dizziness, it's a warning shot, Lester. Your body is telling you something. You're 47, not 27. This isn't a life-threatening event right this minute, but it's a peek into what could be down the road if you don't make some changes, serious changes." He wrote out a prescription for blood pressure medication, then pushed a pamphlet across the desk. "Stress reduction, diet, exercise. And for God's sake, find something that brings you joy, Mr. Thompson. Life's too short to just exist." Lester nodded, numb, clutching the little plastic bottle of pills. He didn't hear the whole lecture. All he heard was, "Warning shot, life's too short." He drove home in a fog, the familiar streets looking strangely alien, every turn a fresh reminder of the fragility he'd just felt in his own chest. That night, 3 a.m. came like a punch in the gut. Lester lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the digital clock on the nightstand casting stark shadows across the room. The house was utterly silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the frantic echoing beat of his own thoughts. The doctor's words replayed in his mind, clear as day. Warning shot. Life's too short. He thought about the factory. The relentless, soul-crushing rhythm of it. The years he'd spent there, the identical Tuesdays blurring into a single, endless workday. He thought about the bills, neatly stacked, always just ahead of his paychecks. He thought about Sarah, his bright, beautiful daughter, and the endless sacrifices he'd made for her. Sacrifices he didn't regret, not truly, but sacrifices that had left him with very little for himself. Then he thought about the workshop. The smell of sawdust, the smooth grain of a planed board, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly fitted joint. He saw the tools, gleaming under the bare bulb, waiting. He saw the unfinished rocking chair he'd started 2 years ago, destined for Sarah's future, a testament to a skill he was too afraid to fully wield. He lay there, stripped bare in the brutal honesty of the pre-dawn dark. He wasn't just tired. He was exhausted to his very bones, exhausted by the weight of unlived dreams, by the cowardice of comfortable routine. He was facing a mirror that night, and the reflection wasn't of the man he'd wanted to be. It was a man on a conveyor belt, moving steadily towards an inevitable end, his hands empty of anything truly meaningful, his heart full of what-ifs. The thought was a cold, bitter draft down his throat. Dying with his potential unfulfilled, forever wondering what if he had just tried. What if he had just tried to live a little before it was too late? The fear of failure, the fear of judgment, suddenly felt small, insignificant compared to the crushing, suffocating fear of regret. The cold clarity of that fear, the fear of what if, was worse than any pain in his chest, worse than any late-night worry about money. He pushed himself up from the mattress, the springs groaning in protest. He didn't turn on the light. The room was still cloaked in that gray, pre-dawn gloom, but something had shifted inside him. It wasn't a sudden burst of energy, no flash of inspiration. It was something quieter, deeper, a stubborn, weary refusal to continue down the same path. He stood by the window, looking out at the faint outline of his neighbor's house, the dark shape of the oak tree in his own yard. "Enough," he whispered into the silence. It wasn't a declaration, more like a sigh escaping from the very core of him. Enough of the turning away, enough of the smallness, enough of letting fear build walls around what he truly wanted. He didn't have a grand plan, didn't know how to bridge the chasm between where he was and where he longed to be. But he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that he couldn't keep doing this. This endless cycle of working, paying, existing, while the best of him withered in the dark. The next morning, the alarm screamed its usual 5 o'clock challenge. For a split second, the familiar inertia, the comfortable weight of his blanket, tried to pull him back under. Just 5 more minutes, the old voice whispered, "What difference will it make?" But the enough from the night before still resonated, a low hum beneath the surface of his exhaustion. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the cold floorboards, a jolt that cleared some of the lingering fog. He made his coffee, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the quiet revolution brewing within him. He didn't reach for his lunch pail, not yet. Instead, he walked past the kitchen, past the living room, and pushed open the door to the small, detached shed he called his workshop. The air in there was cool, heavy with the scent of old wood and something else, something stagnant, like dreams left too long on the shelf. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak morning light filtering through the grimy window. Tools hung on the pegboard, silently accusing. The partially assembled rocking chair stood under a drop cloth, a ghostly shape waiting for a hand to bring it to life. He looked at it. A wave of dread, cold and sharp, washed over him. What if you mess it up? What if it's ugly? What if you're not good enough? The old fears, they hadn't gone anywhere. They were right there, waiting for him. They were the dragons guarding the treasure. Lester took a deep breath, the air catching a little in his chest. He reached for the drop cloth, pulled it off. The unfinished rocking chair sat there, raw, inviting, terrifying. He ran a calloused hand over the smooth, unvarnished armrest he'd shaped months ago. He didn't know where to start. He just knew he had to start. He picked up a block plane, the familiar weight comforting in his hand. Then he grabbed a piece of scrap oak, a practice piece, and set it on the workbench. His hands trembled slightly as he positioned the plane. The first pass was rough, uneven. He gritted his teeth, took another breath, and tried again. A thin, fragrant curl of wood peeled away, followed by another. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was something. It was an act. It was him facing the fear, not running from it, not even conquering it, but just doing a little bit of it. Right there in the quiet solitude of his dusty workshop, before the world woke up, Lester had taken his first step. That first day, the simple act of planing wood felt like a victory. But a victory, Lester quickly learned, was just a flag planted on the first hill in a long, winding mountain range. Day 3, the alarm clock shrieked at 4:30 a.m., and the workshop suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a punishment. His muscles ached from the factory floor, and the memory of the soft, warm bed was a siren call. The partially assembled rocking chair, which had seemed to beckon just days before, now stood there, a silent, immovable judge. He dragged himself out of bed, each step a protest. In the workshop, the oak piece he'd carefully planed now looked ordinary. He tried to cut a mortise and tenon joint, something fundamental for the chair's strength, and his hand slipped. The cut was crooked, a gaping flaw in what was supposed to be precision. A curse, low and guttural, escaped his lips. He wanted to throw the chisel across the room, wanted to kick the chair, wanted to just walk away and never come back. "See," a voice whispered in his head, "you're just wasting time. You're not good enough. You never were." He picked up a different piece of wood, a fresh start, and tried again, his jaw set so tight it hurt. By the end of the first week, the morning routine was a brutal, self-imposed ritual. Some mornings he'd just stare at the tools, the energy drained from him before he even picked one up. He'd think about Sarah, about the bills, about the factory floor where he spent his days trading sweat for a wage that just barely kept things afloat. What was he doing, wasting precious sleep, precious effort on this pipe dream? He almost skipped a morning. Almost. His hand was on the doorknob, ready to just crawl back into bed and pretend the whole health scare, the whole reckoning had never happened. But then a flash of that hospital room, the cold certainty of regret. He saw himself, an old man, looking back on a life filled with almosts and what-ifs. He closed his eyes, took a ragged breath, and turned back towards the workbench. He didn't feel inspired. He didn't feel hopeful. He just felt obligated. Obligated to himself. Obligated to that ghost of a man he didn't want to become. He sanded a small piece of wood methodically, mindlessly, for 20 minutes until the grit of the paper on the grain started to quiet the noise in his head. The battle raged on, day after day. Sometimes the wood splintered, sometimes a measurement was off, sometimes the finished piece just looked amateurish. There were mornings when the fear of failure felt like a physical weight on his chest, pinning him down, mocking his efforts. He'd start a new joint, hands trembling slightly, the doubt a constant hum in his ears. He finished a leg for the rocking chair, spent 3 solid mornings getting the angles just right, only to realize the grain he'd chosen meant it wouldn't match the other 3. He stared at it, a perfectly good but ultimately useless piece of craftsmanship. Frustration boiled, a hot, angry flush creeping up his neck. He wanted to quit. He wanted to give up. He stood there, breathing hard, the smell of sawdust thick in the air. He clenched his fists, then slowly, deliberately, he walked to the scrap bin, dropped the leg in, and picked up a fresh piece of lumber. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was just an act of defiance, small and quiet, against the part of him that wanted to surrender. It was the grit he didn't know he had, showing up just a little bit every single morning. That quiet defiance, that stubborn refusal to quit, started to chip away at something deep inside Lester. Around day 20, something shifted. The familiar dread that used to cling to him like factory dust each evening, the one that made his shoulders slump just thinking about the workbench, began to recede. It didn't vanish entirely, no sir, but it felt smaller, less suffocating. He still approached his craft with a healthy dose of trepidation, but now a flicker of curiosity, a faint hum of possibility, sparked alongside it. The smell of sawdust, once a reminder of his inadequacy, now mingled with a faint satisfaction. His hands, calloused and strong from years on the line, were learning a new kind of finesse, guiding chisels and planes with a nascent confidence. He finished a small, perfectly square jewelry box, the lid fitting with a satisfying thud. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was his, and it was good enough. When Sarah called a few nights later asking about his week, he actually mentioned it. "Finished a little box," he grunted, a quiet pride in his voice he hadn't heard in years. "Oh," she said, genuinely surprised. "You're still doing that, Dad? That's really cool." That simple acknowledgement, a tiny ripple in his carefully constructed isolation, felt like sunshine on his skin. At the factory, old man Frank, who'd seen men come and go for 40 years, squinted at Lester one morning during break. "You been sleepin' better, Lester?" he asked, a knowing look in his rheumy eyes. Lester just shrugged, took a pull from his coffee. "Something," he mumbled. But Frank saw the subtle easing around his mouth, the way Lester's shoulders didn't seem quite so permanently hunched. He wasn't a different man yet, not entirely, but the cracks in his old shell were starting to show, letting a little light in. The heavy weight of what if hadn't disappeared, but it had thinned, revealing glimpses of a landscape he'd long given up on seeing. Hope, a fragile, almost forgotten thing, began to unfurl in his chest, like a tight bud finally opening to the spring sun. Weeks rolled into months. Lester's small workshop, once a place of hesitant obligation, became a sanctuary. The fear was still there, sure, a constant, low thrum, especially when he tried a new technique or considered showing his work to others. But now it wasn't a wall. It was a companion, a persistent shadow that sharpened his focus, pushed him to refine, to improve. He learned to listen to it, acknowledge it, and then stubbornly keep working anyway. His garage door, usually closed tight, started to open more often on weekends. Curious neighbors would peek in, drawn by the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his mallet on wood. Lester, once gruff and reticent, found himself answering questions, explaining a dovetail joint, talking about the grain of a particular oak. The first local craft fair was a blur of clammy hands and racing heart. He almost packed up 3 times. But then a woman bought a small, intricately carved bird feeder, complimenting his eye for detail. The $5 bill in his hand felt heavier than any paycheck he'd ever earned. It was proof, tangible and undeniable, that he wasn't just wasting time. He was creating. He was good enough. Sarah started visiting more often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. She'd sit on a stool in the workshop, watching him work, sometimes sketching designs he could try. "Dad," she'd said one evening, holding up a small cedar box with a perfectly fitted lid. "This is incredible. You really built this." And the look in her eyes, that genuine admiration, filled a void in Lester he hadn't realized was so vast. He still worked at the factory, his hands still moved with the practiced rhythm of his job, but now his mind wasn't just counting the hours. It was sketching, planning, dreaming of the next piece of wood. He walked a little taller, his eyes, though still tired, held a different kind of light, a steady inner glow. The man was the same, but his world, viewed through newly opened eyes, had utterly transformed. "Ain't no magic trick to it," Lester would grumble, a faint smile playing on his lips as he sanded a smooth curve. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, just thinking aloud the way men do when they've finally figured something out. "You just gotta look at what scares you most, then do a little bit of it every single day. Doesn't gotta be a mountain, just a pebble. The mountain gets smaller, or maybe you just get bigger. You just show up." And that's how a man named Lester, who thought his best days were behind